welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 2 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Baptism by Fire. Now, typically at the top of the show I'd have any number of housekeeping announcements to make, but seeing as how there appears to be nothing too pressing at the moment, let's just get into the narrative. To recap, in the first episode of this series, we introduced our protagonist, Gilbert de Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette. For the sake of brevity, I've elected to refer to him simply as Lafayette, or occasionally as the Marquis. Lafayette was born on September 6, 1757, in a small hamlet named Chavagnac, in the Auvergne region of south-central France. His family belonged to the French nobility, and though the House of Lafayette was not the wealthiest or most prestigious in the realm, it was widely recognized for its long lineage of distinguished military men. Lafayette's own father, Michel, had died in the service of the king, meeting his end on a German battlefield during the 7 Years' War. His 2-year-old son, who now bore the title of Marquis de Lafayette, was cared for by his grandmother, his 2 aunts, and his tutor, a Jesuit priest called the Abbé Féon, while his mother went off to live with her father in Paris. Lafayette's idyllic early childhood in Chavagnac came to an abrupt end at age 10, when his mother summoned him to move to Paris and join her. Lafayette found it difficult to adjust to life in the French capital, then one of the largest and most important cities in the world, but with the help of his mother and grandfather, he was beginning to find his bearings. 2 years later, though, both of them died, suddenly and in quick succession. The 12-year-old Lafayette was now an orphan, but thanks to the vast properties he inherited from his late mother and grandfather, he became one of the richest individuals in all of France. It was not long before another noble family, more prestigious than his own, approached him with the intention of arranging for him to wed one of their daughters. This family was the Noailles family, and the daughter in question was named Marie Adrienne Françoise de Noailles, more often referred to as just Adrienne. Lafayette was invited to move into the family's residence at Versailles. Although the truth of the engagement was initially kept secret from the future bride and groom, Adrienne quickly developed feelings for Lafayette, feelings that he would not be able to fully reciprocate until after the pair were married. At Versailles, Lafayette was forced once again to adjust to new and difficult surroundings. He struggled to adhere to the unwritten code of conduct which governed daily life in the palace. The once jovial and outgoing boy became withdrawn and taciturn, traits that did not win him many friends. Finding himself unable to fit in at Versailles, Lafayette longed for an opportunity to extricate himself from the stifling environment of the court and to follow in the footsteps of his ancestors by winning glory on the battlefield. His father-in-law, the Duc d'Ayen, secured for him a commission as an officer in the Noailles family regiment, and shortly after his wedding to Adrienne in May 1774, Lafayette was sent to join the regiment in the town of Metz. It was here that Lafayette forged 2 new friendships that would serve him well for the rest of his life, one with his brother-in-law, Louis the Vicomte de Noailles, and another with a fellow nobleman, future diplomat Louis-Philippe, Comte de Ségur. After spending the summer undergoing basic training and familiarizing himself with basic aspects of military life, Lafayette returned to Versailles, where he passed another year floundering in the vicinity of the untested new king, Louis XVI, and his high-strung and controversial wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. 1775 was sure to be a pivotal year in Lafayette's life. He would turn 18 that September, at which time he would be permitted to take an active role in commanding the Noailles Dragoons. But, as it would turn out, events would take him in a far more different direction. It was while continuing his training in Metz that Lafayette first learned of the American War of Independence from the commander of the city's garrison, the Comte de Broglie. Broglie was an eccentric man with a predisposition towards international intrigue. In the years following France's humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, Broglie and others like him had been scheming to find ways to undermine the power of Great Britain. The nascent rebellion in Britain's North American colonies appeared to offer them just such an opportunity. Broglie, who brought young Lafayette and friends into his inner circle, regaled them with tales of the bravery of the American rebels, or the insurgents, as they were referred to by the French. From the moment that Lafayette first heard of the rebels' cause, he desired nothing more than to go to America and to help them fight for the cause of liberty. For Lafayette, the American cause appealed to him in more ways than one. He saw it as an opportunity to avenge France's defeat in the 7 Years' War. the same conflict in which his own father had been killed. On a more fundamental level, though, Lafayette strongly identified with the Americans and their desire for freedom. Lafayette was raised on a curriculum that was heavy on classical Greek and Roman writers, and over the course of his education, the young and impressionable Lafayette imbibed a strong passion for Republican ideals. In due time, Lafayette would come to view the American cause as a hugely important test for the ideals in which he believed. His determination to go to America and fight for the rebel cause only grew when, the following year, the passage of military reforms stymied the chance for him to have a career in the army. Still, getting to the New World would be no simple task. There were many obstacles standing in the way, not the least of which being his own family. Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, had given birth to a child in December 1775, and she was expecting another soon. Moreover, Lafayette knew that his father-in-law would never give his consent to such a reckless adventure. But he was not one to be deterred. Instead of asking his family for permission, he instead approached Broglie, and asked to be introduced to Silas Deane, an American diplomat in Paris who was currently recruiting French military officers to the Continental Army. Broglie was initially hesitant, but eventually arranged the meeting. Upon introducing himself, Lafayette made it a point to downplay his youth and inexperience, and instead to play up his noble rank, immense wealth, and zeal for the cause. He also suggested that, given his connections at court, he could work effectively to promote American interests to the French government. Deane was convinced and had Lafayette enrolled as a major general in the Continental Army. To get across the Atlantic Ocean, Lafayette, with his own funds, purchased a merchant vessel, which he rechristened La Victoire, or the Victory. By the spring of 1777, Lafayette was making the final preparations to travel to America. The only loose end remaining was to inform his father-in-law, the Duke d'Ayen, of his intentions, and hope that he would give his blessing. Predictably, he did not receive it. The Duke flew into a rage, and asked the king to intervene to prevent him from leaving the country. The king did so, threatening Lafayette with serious consequences if he did not abort his adventure and return to Versailles at once. Lafayette may well have complied, but after being told that the king and his ministers actually supported his decision, he stayed the course, and on April 20th, 1777, the Victoire set off for the New World. For Lafayette, the journey across the Atlantic Ocean was a decidedly unpleasant one, spending days on end confined to a small cramped cabin where he was subjected to the winds and waves which rocked the ship. Having never before been aboard a ship in his life, it took him about a week to adjust physically to the stresses of being on the open sea. The nausea and vertigo he suffered from gave way to a different sort of affliction, boredom. As he described in a letter back home, quote, "One day follows after another, and what's worse, they are all alike. Nothing but sky and water, and tomorrow it will be just the same." End quote. He tried to relieve the tedium by spending much time below deck, intently studying two subjects that were certain to be crucial to his success as an officer in the American Army: military theory and the English language. It was not before an entire month had passed that Lafayette finally brought himself to write home to his wife. His hesitation in this regard is understandable. After all, he'd abandoned his pregnant wife without so much as a word, only a letter that was to be given to her after he had departed. Worse, his object in doing this was to go off on a reckless adventure to aid some rebels halfway across the world that might very well end up with him being dead or a prisoner of Great Britain. Once he managed to work up the courage to write to Adrienne, he dashed off numerous letters, many of which are sentimental to the point of being melodramatic. The first of these letters, dated May 30th, reads in part, quote, "It is from far away that I write to you, sweetheart, and to this cruel separation is added the still more dreadful uncertainty of the time when I shall hear from you again. Have you forgiven me? Your grief, that of my friends and our daughter, all this came into my mind with rightful vividness, and for an instant I felt I had nothing to say in defense of what I was about to do. If you knew what I have suffered, what weary days have passed, fleeing everything I love best in the world, must I yet learn, besides all this, that you refuse to forgive me? Indeed, my sweetheart, in that event I should be too unhappy." End quote. The second letter, written a few days after the first, begins, quote, "I am still out on this dreary plain, which is beyond comparison the most dismal place that one can be in. I try to console myself a little by thinking of you and our friends at home, and I picture the joy when I come home and rush in, unexpectedly, to take you into my arms, and perhaps I shall find you with our children." End quote. Further on in this same letter, Lafayette attempts to explain himself, to offer a justification for his actions. Quote, "You must admit, sweetheart, that the occupation and life that I am going to have are very different from those that have been arranged for me. While defending the liberty that I adore of my own free will, as a friend, offering my services to this most interesting republic, I bring nothing with me but my heart and goodwill, with no personal ambitions to fulfill, no selfish interests to serve, working only for my own glory and for the happiness of the American Republic. I hope that for my sake you too will become a good American, for that feeling is worthy of every noble heart. The happiness of America is intimately connected with the happiness of all mankind. She is destined to become the safe and venerable asylum of political virtue, of honesty, of tolerance, and of peaceful liberty." End quote. One can imagine that in this letter, Lafayette was trying to convince himself that he'd made the right decision, as much as his intended recipient. On June 12th, 54 days after their departure, the crew of the Victoire spotted land. As they approached their final destination, the port of Charleston, South Carolina, they encountered an American blockade runner. The crew of the ship informed them that Charleston was currently under a British blockade, and that they should make landfall somewhere further north. The next day, the Victoire laid anchor at North Island, near Georgetown, in South Carolina. Later that afternoon, Lafayette, the Baron de Kalb, and 4 other officers set out on a rowboat, traveling north along the coast, searching for some local guides who could help them get their bearings. It was late at night before they finally encountered another person, 4 of them to be precise, all of them black men in a rowboat fishing for oysters. Ironically, the first people that Lafayette encountered in his sojourn to the land of the free were slaves. The enslaved fishermen agreed to take these foreigners to the house of their master, Isaac Huger, a major in the South Carolina militia and the owner of a large rice plantation. It was around midnight that Lafayette and company finally made it to shore. As he later recalled, quote, "When I felt American soil under my feet for the first time that night, my words were an oath to conquer or perish for the American cause." End quote. As they approached the plantation house, there was a brief standoff as the major tried to discern whether these men approaching in the dead of night were friend or foe. Once reassured that his visitors had noble intentions, Major Huger invited the officers into his house for food and rest. Lafayette later wrote home describing his first day in America, quote, "I retired to rest that night, rejoicing that I had landed safely in America beyond the reach of my pursuers. The next morning was beautiful. Everything around me seemed new. The room, the bed draped in mosquito curtains, the black servants who came to me quietly to ask my commands, the strange new beauty of the landscape outside my windows, the luxurious vegetation, all combined to produce a magical effect and to fill me with indescribable sensations." End quote. To the pleasant surprise of the travelers, they learned that their hosts, the descendants of French Protestants, were fluent in French, something that lessened the shock of having arrived in this strange new world. The day after their arrival at Major Huger's plantation, Huger sent a guide to lead the Victoire around the blockade and into the port at Charleston, while Lafayette, de Kalb, and the others set off for the city on foot. They were forced to trek through the inhospitable terrain that characterized the American South: sands, swamps, dense forests, and the like. They had little choice but to abandon many of their personal belongings, their luggage, boots, and overcoats. After 3 days, they reached Charleston. The journey had clearly taken its toll on them, according to de Kalb, quote, "We arrived looking like beggars and brigands. People mocked us when we said that we were French officers here to defend their liberty. Even the large number of French who had preceded us to Charleston called us adventurers." End quote. The large number of French that de Kalb mentioned were, for the most part, low-ranking officers who had previously served in France's colonial holdings in the Caribbean, like Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. These men were hardly better than mercenaries, with most having come to America to escape debt or dishonor elsewhere. The questionable moral character of these Frenchmen created a less than favorable impression on the American people. Anti-French sentiment had become widespread, even among the revolutionary leadership. In a letter to John Hancock, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, expressed his growing frustration with the scores of French officers pouring into the country, quote, "What Congress expects I am to do with the many foreigners they have at different times promoted to the rank of field officers I do not know. These men have no attachment nor ties to the country, and are ignorant of the language they are to receive and give orders in. Our officers think it exceedingly hard to have strangers put over them, whose merit is perhaps not equal to their own, but whose effrontery will take no denial." End quote. Recently, Congress had agreed to stop granting military commissions to foreigners without Washington's express approval. It was yet to be seen whether Washington would come to see Lafayette as an exception to the dozens of foreign officers constantly being foisted on him, but the citizenry of Charleston changed their tune on Lafayette when, the following day, his ship, the Victoire, arrived in port. They had naturally assumed that he, like the scores of more unscrupulous French officers who had turned up there, was lying about his rank and status back in Europe. The fact that he had owned the ship that he had arrived on proved that the young Marquis was telling the truth. Their disposition towards Lafayette and his party changed instantaneously, according to DeKalb. Quote, "Everyone welcomed us everywhere. The Frenchman who had been the first to mock us paid homage obsequiously to the Marquis, and sought to enlist in his expedition. The city's leading citizens opened their arms to us, and entertained us for 8 days of feasts and gala celebrations. They showed the Marquis all the honors due to a Marshal of France and a Protector of Liberty." End quote. Many of the city's leading figures were also quite impressed by the fact that Lafayette was, like them, a Freemason. Writing home to Adrienne, Lafayette reported, quote, "This beautiful city is worthy of its inhabitants. Everything bespoke comfort, even luxury. Without even knowing me, Governor Rutledge eagerly received me with the utmost kindness and attention." End quote. After spending about a week being feted by the people of Charleston, Lafayette and company prepared to make their next move. In order to formally accept their commission offers, they would have to go to Philadelphia and present their documentation to the Continental Congress. Unfortunately for them, they had no choice but to make the journey overland. So Lafayette purchased horses and carriages for him, his companions, and their supplies, using proceeds from the sale of the Victoire's cargo. Traveling by sea would have made for a more expedient journey, but according to the terms of the contract Lafayette signed when purchasing the vessel, the Victoire was obligated to return to Bordeaux, bearing American cargo as soon as possible. The ship departed Charleston Harbor after a few days, but unfortunately, it hit a sandbar and sank off the South Carolina coast. Lafayette and company set out for Philadelphia on June 25th. Lafayette had expected a pleasant journey through the idyllic American countryside, but as he and the others soon discovered, the carriages they purchased were not at all suited for such a long journey along country roads. By the 4th day of travel, the carriages broke down somewhere in North Carolina. The travelers were forced to abandon the carriages along with much of their belongings and continue the journey on horseback. It was a decidedly unpleasant one. For the unacclimatized Europeans, the heat of the American South in midsummer was almost unbearable, and many of them fell ill with diseases like yellow fever. Baron de Kalb thought the situation was so bad that he, quote, "feared we would have to bury all of our young men," end quote. Another officer in the group, Charles-François Dubuisson, claimed, quote, "No campaign in all of Europe could have been harder than this voyage," end quote. Many in the group nearly lost their nerve and turned around, but Lafayette remained in good spirits throughout, as indicated by the following letter to his wife, quote, "You know that I departed most handsomely in a carriage. Now we are all on horseback, having broken the carriages. I expect to write to you in a few days, saying that we have arrived on foot." End quote. Surely enough, this prediction came true a few days later, when their horses began to collapse from exhaustion. Still, Lafayette continued to marvel at the sights of this country despite the difficult circumstances. In another letter back home, he wrote, quote, "I have experienced no ill effects. The farther I advance north, the better pleased I am with this country and its people. They refuse me no kindness or attention, even though most hardly know who I am. The Americans are defined by a simplicity of manners, a desire to please, a love of country and liberty, and an easy equality prevails everywhere here. The richest man and the poorest man are on the same level. Every individual has an adequate amount of property. What pleases me most is that all citizens are brothers. Everyone has the same rights as everyone else." End quote. The sentiments expressed in this letter conform to a set of preconceived notions that were quite common among the educated class in France. They idealized America and its people as exemplifying, among other things, natural innocence, rugged individualism, and egalitarianism, and a certain plain-spokenness and sincerity. In short, qualities they felt were lacking in their own society. Oftentimes, this rose-tinted view would disintegrate shortly after having actually traveled to America. And while Lafayette would eventually come to adopt a more nuanced view of American society as time went on, at that moment his smile and optimism remained fully intact, and he inspired his traveling companions to keep pressing on despite the difficult journey. Finally, on July 27, 1777, Lafayette and his beleaguered companions trudged into Philadelphia. It had been little over a month since they departed Charleston, and nearly 100 days since they first left Europe. During this time, Lafayette had made it a point to write home to his wife frequently, as we've seen, but it would be still another month before any of his correspondence reached France. Lafayette's family feared the worst, that he'd been lost at sea, never to be heard from again. Adrienne, whose second child was due any day now, grew increasingly despondent, while her mother did her best to comfort her. The Prime Minister of France, the Comte de Maurepas, sent a letter to Lafayette's uncle-in-law, the French ambassador to Great Britain, quote, "I am truly distressed for your family. I had the honor of seeing the boy's grandfather-in-law yesterday, and he seemed to me to be as distressed as I know that you are. Neither you nor your family have any reason for self-reproach, and the king in no way holds you responsible for the behavior of a young man whose head had been turned." End quote. The attitude of the general public in France was quite different. They celebrated Lafayette's daring act and eagerly awaited news from the New World of his victories there. Meanwhile, Lafayette and company, who had arrived in the American capital in, quote, "a more pitiable condition even than when we first came into Charleston," end quote, were soon to receive an even worse initial reception than they had in Charleston. After brushing the dirt from their clothes, the group first went to the Pennsylvania State House, which at that time housed the Continental Congress. Unfortunately for them, no one had checked the date. It was a Sunday, and Congress was not in session. They instead went to present themselves at the home of John Hancock, a wealthy merchant from Boston, who presently served as the president of the Continental Congress. To their disappointment, Hancock would not receive them, telling the French officers that they were not his problem to deal with. He suggested they instead call on another representative, Robert Morris, from Pennsylvania. Morris they found to be just as unaccommodating as Hancock, suggesting that they should report to the State House the next day, although Morris was at least kind enough to help the men find lodgings for the night. Promptly reporting to the State House in the morning, Lafayette, DeKalb, and 12 other officers were met by Morris at the front door, who then directed them to speak with another congressman, James Lovell of Massachusetts, who Morris introduced as, quote, "a gentleman who speaks French very well and has been charged with dealing with all of your countrymen," end quote. They quickly found that Lovell wanted nothing to do with them either. Before they were able to finish introducing themselves, Lovell cut them off and launched into an angry tirade, referring to the group as mere adventurers, and cursing Silas Deane for, quote, "sending us every French scoundrel with delusions of grandeur that he can find, each more pompous, useless, and offensive than the last," end quote. Continuing, Lovell brusquely dismissed the group, saying, quote, "It seems that French officers have a great fancy to enter our service without being invited. It is true we were in need of officers last year, but now we have experienced men and plenty of them," end quote. His rant concluded, Lovell scoffed, turned around, and closed the door right in their faces. The men left standing outside on the street were bewildered, though one of Lafayette's companions noted that, to his credit, Lovell did indeed speak French very well. In any event, the way that they had been treated was a far cry from the overly formal and obsequiously polite mannerisms of Versailles. Lafayette could not understand why they had been treated in such a manner. In truth, it was through no fault of their own, but they could hardly have arrived in America at a less opportune moment. The American war effort was faltering. Earlier that month, a British army led by General John Burgoyne had captured the strategically crucial Fort Ticonderoga on the border between New York and Vermont. A large force of loyalists was currently on its way from downstate to join them. Meanwhile, an armada carrying 20,000 British regulars had set sail from British-occupied New York City, most likely bound for the American capital of Philadelphia. The situation, in short, was stressful enough as it was, and the constant arrival of new officers from France did not help matters. As I described earlier, their haughty attitude, martial ineptitude, their deceitfully inflated ranks, and their accordingly inflated demands for compensation had earned them only the resentment of the Americans. In fact, at the time that Lafayette and company arrived, the capital was still abuzz with controversy regarding one of these Frenchmen in particular, Philippe Charles Tronçon du Coudray. Coudray was one of the many officers recruited by Silas Deane in Paris who promised him the rank of Major General, an appointment as the Chief of Field Artillery, and an annual salary of 300,000 livres, equivalent to about $3 million. He arrived in Philadelphia about a month prior, and Congress begrudgingly agreed to honor the terms of the agreement that he'd made with Dean. Infuriated at the prospect of being outranked by a foreigner, 3 of the Continental Army's generals, including the current Chief of Artillery Henry Knox, threatened to resign if Coutret's appointment was confirmed. A more thorough investigation into Coutret's background revealed that he had lied about his previous rank in the French army. He was not a brigadier general as he claimed, but in fact had risen no higher than the rank of major. In light of this information, Congress instead assigned Coutret as the Army's Inspector General. The whole situation would resolve itself in September when Coutret fell into a river and drowned, but the controversy from the whole affair had led Congress to recall Dean from Paris on the grounds that he'd overstepped the limits of his authority by making it appear to the officers he recruited that he had the ability to make military appointments, confer commissions, and so on. In reality, these powers belonged to Congress exclusively, which, at this point, considered the offers that Dean had made to be effectively null and void. But, as we've seen, Lafayette was not one to be deterred. Unwilling to return ignominiously back to France, Lafayette wrote a petition to Congress in the hopes of convincing them that he, unlike his fellow countrymen, was deserving of the commission that Dean had offered him. Quote, "After the sacrifices I have made for this cause, I have the right to exact 2 favors. One is to serve at my own expense. The other is to serve first as a volunteer." End quote. The next morning, James Lavelle paid Lafayette a visit. Some mistakes had been made, he explained, and Congress was willing to accept his conditions. Upon a careful review of the letter of recommendation written by Dean, as well as testimonials written by leading citizens of Charleston, they realized that Lafayette was in fact telling the truth, unlike so many of his countrymen who preceded him. He was, in fact, a real Marquis, the scion of one of France's leading noble families, with an immense fortune and prominent connections in Versailles. Of course, his willingness to forego a salary and to pay his own expenses made Congress a bit more willing to hear his case. On July 31st, Congress passed the following resolution, quote, "Whereas the Marquis de Lafayette, out of his great zeal to the cause of liberty in which the United States are engaged, has left his family and connections, and at his own expense, come over to offer his services to the United States without pension or particular allowance, and is anxious to risk his life for our cause. Resolved, that his service be accepted, and that in consideration of his zeal, illustrious family, and connections, he have the rank of Major General in the Army of the United States." End quote. Congress had been somewhat reluctant to grant him the rank that he asked for on account of his youth and inexperience, but practically speaking, they understood the appointment to be little more than a ceremonial one, done in the hopes of improving relations with France. South Carolina politician Henry Laurens said as much in a private letter explaining Congress's decision, quote, "We expect the Marquis to have a short campaign, then probably return to France and secure to us the powerful interest of his high and extensive connections." End quote. In a letter to General Washington, Benjamin Franklin, one of America's unofficial ambassadors to France, spoke highly of the Marquis and urged the commander-in-chief to treat him courteously but to keep him at arm's length. Quote, "The Marquis de Lafayette, a young nobleman of great family connections here and wealth, has gone to America in a ship of his own, accompanied by some officers of distinction, to serve in our armies. He is exceedingly beloved, and everybody's good wishes attend him. We cannot but hope he may meet with a reception as will make the country and this expedition agreeable to him. We are satisfied that the civilities and respect that may be shown him will be serviceable to our affairs here, and pleasing not only to his powerful relations and to the court, but to the whole French nation. He has left behind a beautiful young wife, with child, and for her sake particularly, we hope that his bravery and ardent desire to distinguish himself will be a little restrained by the general's prudence, so as to not permit his being hazarded much, but on some important occasion." End quote. From these documents and others, it is clear that everyone understood Lafayette's appointment to be a mostly symbolic one, save for Lafayette himself, as he indicated in a letter of thanks he wrote to President Hancock, in faltering but serviceable English, quote, "I shall neglect nothing on my part to justify the confidence which the Congress of the United States has been pleased to repose in me, as my highest ambition has ever been to do everything only for the best of the cause in which I am engaged. I wish to serve near the person of General Washington until such time as he may think proper to entrust me with a division of the army." End quote. In this same letter, Lafayette, perhaps a bit presumptuously, advocated on behalf of the other officers who had traveled with him to America. Quote, "It is now as an American that I'll mention every day to Congress the officers who came over with me, whose interests are for me as my own, and the consideration which they deserve by their merits, their ranks, their state and reputation in France." End quote. Congress paid little heed to this appeal. Lafayette was told that he could hire 2 of them as aides-de-camp. He chose 2 of the youngest men in the group, Jean-Joseph Sourbadet de Gimat, age 30, and Louis Morel, Chevalier de la Colombe, age 22. The rest were simply dismissed out of hand, and most would return to France empty-handed before the year was out, with the notable exception of the Baron de Kalb. Before he left for Charleston, from where he planned to return to France, de Kalb dashed off a letter of his own to the President of Congress, which reads in part, quote, "I do not think that either my name, my services, or my person are proper objects to be trifled with. I cannot tell you, sir, how deeply I feel the injury done to me, and how ridiculous it seems to me to make people leave their homes, families, and affairs to cross the sea under 1,000 dangers, to be received and looked at with contempt by those from whom you were to expect warm thanks." End quote. De Kalb threatened to take legal action against Dean upon his return to France. His threat worked, and Congress granted him the commission that Dean originally offered him. They sent a rider to intercept him on the road and inform him of their decision, and he accepted the rank on September 5th. Exactly why Congress took de Kalb's threat so seriously is up for speculation. Most historians maintain they feared such a lawsuit would endanger their position in France, the potential repercussions being the expulsion of American diplomats from the country and the preclusion of any future material or diplomatic support. On the night of August 1st, the very next day after formally accepting his commission, Lafayette had an opportunity to meet for the first time the man who would have such a profound impact on his life, George Washington. It just so happened that Washington had come to the capital to meet with Congress. Arriving that evening, a dinner was held in his honor at a local tavern which Lafayette attended. He later recalled the moment he first saw the leader whom he referred to as that great man. Standing at 6 feet and 4 inches tall, Washington cut quite an imposing figure. Though he was surrounded by a coterie of officers, aides, and other assorted hangers-on, Lafayette was easily able to identify him from amidst the crowd. Quote, "It was impossible not to recognize the majesty of his face and his countenance. The affable and noble manners and the dignity with which he addressed those around him were equally distinguished." End quote. Lafayette was positively starstruck, but their admiration was not mutual, at least at first. The general had been briefed in advance about the persistent 19-year-old whom Congress had made a major general against his wishes. Recent experiences had taught Washington to distrust the multitude of French mercenaries he'd been burdened with, and like many other Americans, he was not partial to the French to begin with. But, at least during this first encounter with the Marquis, he evinced no sign of these prejudices. It's also worth noting that both men were Freemasons, a fact that positively affected Washington's perception of the Marquis. After the dinner concluded, Washington took Lafayette aside and, in Lafayette's own words, quote, "expressed his goodwill towards me. He complimented me for my zeal and sacrifice in coming to America, and in the most friendly manner he invited me to reside in his house. I would have the happiness of living in the general quarters of the commander-in-chief as part of his household. This offer I accepted with the same sincerity with which it was made. He then warned me that he could not promise the luxuries of a king's court, but now that I had become an American soldier, I would undoubtedly adapt, with good grace, to the hardships of life in a Republican army." End quote. Washington referred to the circle of aides and officers attached to his person at any given time as his household or his family, and though he meant this more in a metaphorical sense than anything else, Lafayette clearly took it to mean something more personal. Much has been made of the relationship between Washington and Lafayette. For Lafayette, his first meeting with Washington was a pivotal moment in his life, the beginning of a relationship that he would cherish for years to come, and his first encounter with a man whose example he would constantly seek to emulate. In his book, Citizens, a Chronicle of the French Revolution, author Simon Schama provides an analysis of Lafayette's idealized perception of Washington and how he appeared to be the very embodiment of virtue. Quote, "For many of Lafayette's contemporaries in the French nobility, America corresponded precisely to their ideal version of a society happily separated from the cynicism and decrepitude of the Old World. Its people represented to some degree the admired qualities of innocence, rugged directness, and freedom. In George Washington, all these qualities were writ large, and added to them in Lafayette's eyes were the virtues of heroes of antiquity: stoicism, fortitude in adversity, personal bravery and self-sacrifice, incorruptibility, lack of personal ambition, contempt for faction and intrigue, loftiness of soul, even the taciturn reserve that rebuked the insincere loquacity of the old world. Reflected in the doting gaze of the adopted son, Washington became a paragon of all virtues, martial, personal, and political. To a striking degree, he resembled the perfect leader because he also appeared to be the perfect father. Simultaneously strong and compassionate, just and solicitous, the citizen general who cared paternally for his men and by extension for his new nation." End quote. As the last part of that passage suggests, to Lafayette, Washington would serve not just an idol, but also as a father figure, and on a deeply personal level at that. Lafayette, who had grown up in the absence of his biological father, and whose relationship with his father-in-law never became particularly close, it was natural that he would come to regard Washington as a sort of surrogate father. As for Washington, Lafayette was not the only person who regarded him in this filial manner, but, as a few different biographers have posited, it was not often that Washington reciprocated these feelings and played the role of a father in such a personal and emotional way as he would eventually do with Lafayette. To paraphrase Mike Duncan in Hero of Two Worlds, quote, "Lafayette broke through Washington's legendary reserve in a way that those who knew the general best considered unique and unprecedented." End quote. Again, though, it would take some time before Washington would warm towards Lafayette, and during this first meeting between the two, it's unlikely that he would have regarded the Marquis as anything more than a minor nuisance, whom he was being made to tolerate for reasons of diplomatic expediency. Lafayette spent the next several days gathering supplies and equipping himself and his two aides-de-camp for their first campaign. On August 20th, Washington invited Lafayette to join him in reviewing the army. Upon reaching the encampment just north of Philadelphia, Lafayette observed that the Continental Army did not quite measure up to his notion of what a professional military was meant to look like. Quote, "About 11,000 men, ill-armed and still worse clothed, presented a strange spectacle. Their clothes were motley-looking, discolored, and many were practically naked. The best dressed wore hunting shirts, large gray linen tunics worn in the Carolinas." End quote. This description comes from a private letter that Lafayette wrote after the fact. At that moment, he was careful to keep criticism like this to himself. Nonetheless, Washington could sense Lafayette's disappointment, telling him, quote, "We ought to be embarrassed to show ourselves to an officer who has just left the French forces." End quote. To this, Lafayette replied, quote, "My general, I am here to learn, not to teach." End quote. It was this humble response that contrasted so greatly with the attitudes of the other French officers he'd encountered previously that convinced Washington that perhaps Lafayette was different from the rest of them after all. Lafayette himself assigned great significance to this exchange, as he later wrote, quote, "Those simple words established the first bonds of mutual confidence and devotion that united two friends." End quote. The next day, Washington invited Lafayette to sit in on a meeting of the War Council. The Americans had spent much of the summer of 1777 ill at ease, trying to anticipate their enemy's next move. The British Armada that had set out from New York City earlier that month had given them great cause for concern. Initially, it was feared that they would attempt to enter Delaware Bay and to land their forces in southern New Jersey, within striking distance of the capital. But according to more recent reports, the fleet had been spotted further south, suggesting to the American leadership that their target might be Charleston instead of Philadelphia. A short time later, a highly distressing report reached them. The British fleet, instead of sailing up Delaware Bay, had opted instead to sail up the relatively undefended Chesapeake Bay. On August 22nd, British forces landed at Head of Elk, a town in northeastern Maryland, now known as Elkton. The enemy was now less than 50 miles southwest of Philadelphia. Washington moved his army to mount a defense of the capital. He chose to make his stand at a place called Chad's Ford, 20 miles southeast of the city. Chad's Ford sat on the banks of Brandywine Creek, a long and winding waterway that formed the last natural barrier between British troops and the capital. Then, on September 11th, the main British force encountered the Americans at Brandywine. That morning, American forces opened fire on the approaching British and Hessian soldiers through the dense fog that covered the battlefield, and the battle raged on well into the day. Around noon, Washington was informed that a second smaller British force of 8,000 men under Lord Charles Cornwallis were approaching from the northeast. The Americans were in danger of being outflanked. With this most recent development, Lafayette, who up until this point had stayed with Washington at his command headquarters, asked permission to go to the front and attempt to rally the troops. Over the last several weeks, Lafayette had been consistently pestering Washington to be given command over his own division, prompting a frustrated Washington to write to Congress for clarification regarding the nature of Lafayette's appointment. Quote, "What the designs of Congress regarding this gentleman were, and what line of conduct I am to pursue, I know no more than an unborn child." End quote. Congress's response confirmed what he believed to be the case, that they never intended for Lafayette to actually command troops in battle. Washington told Lafayette that he would not give him his own division, but that he should still consider him to be a member of his military household. This did little to temper Lafayette's desire to participate in battle firsthand, and he fully expected to be given his own command at some point in the future. On the afternoon of September 11th, as the battle raged on, General Washington had more pressing matters to attend to than to try and talk Lafayette down from riding off to the front, so he granted his request. Eagerly mounting his horse, Lafayette, flanked by his two aides, galloped off towards the battlefield. By the time Lafayette reached the front lines, enemy troops had already crossed the creek and were steadily advancing towards the American lines. In the face of the seemingly unstoppable British advance, American soldiers began to panic and flee. Lafayette would have none of it. He raced up and down the lines, shouting at the men to turn around and fight, but when this didn't work, he dismounted and started grabbing men by the shoulders to physically turn them around. Some did as they were ordered, but it would not be enough. The defense faltered, and as more and more soldiers fell around him, Lafayette ordered the men to retreat. At some point during the battle, one of Lafayette's aides noticed blood pouring from a wound in his left leg. Lafayette had been struck by a musket ball in his calf, and amidst the chaos and confusion, he had not even noticed. Even after being made aware of the wound, he insisted on continuing the fight, but after a while he began to grow weak from the loss of blood. Schama and La Colombe helped the wounded Marquis back onto his horse, and he left the battlefield, heading for the nearby town of Chester. Around dusk, Washington ordered a full retreat. Later, he caught up with Lafayette on a bridge near Chester. Lafayette was nearly unconscious, still hoarsely barking out orders in broken English for the men to cover their retreating comrades, still trying in vain to impose some measure of order on the chaotic retreat. Admirable as his efforts may have been, Washington ordered Lafayette to stand down. He had a 19-year-old Army captain named James Monroe, yes, that James Monroe, the future president, to escort Lafayette to the safety of a nearby church. Fluent in French, Monroe would eventually forge a strong friendship with the Marquis. Washington also made sure that his personal physician saw to Lafayette's injury, instructing him, quote, "Treat him as though he were my son," end quote. Luckily for him, the wound he suffered was neither life-threatening nor crippling. The following day, Lafayette was carried to a boat, which would ferry him up the Delaware River to Philadelphia, just as preparations were being made to evacuate the city. Upon returning to Philadelphia, Lafayette briefly reunited with some of his companions who traveled with him aboard the Victoire. After securing his own position, Lafayette had continued to write to Congress on behalf of his companions, vouching for their character and asking for them to be admitted. Despite this, only DeKalb had been made an offer. The others were currently making arrangements to return to France. They suggested that Lafayette follow suit, but he refused. For Lafayette, the Battle of Brandywine was only the beginning, the first of what he hoped would be his many battles. He was determined to stay and see this conflict through to a victorious conclusion. Lafayette's companions were quite impressed by his exploits. One of them joked rather presciently that his wound would purchase him more fame than his money ever could. Washington had been pleasantly surprised and quite impressed by Lafayette's bravery. In his dispatch from the Battle of Brandywine, he made it a point to single out Lafayette for his actions, reporting that, quote, "The Marquis de Lafayette was wounded in the leg," end quote. Surely enough, these words made it onto newspapers across the country, thereby introducing Lafayette to American audiences and sparking a public fascination with this young French nobleman who had risked his life to defend the cause of liberty. It didn't take long for the news to reach France, sparking false rumors of his death. Lafayette's mother-in-law nearly fainted upon hearing one such report, and made great effort to prevent such rumors from reaching her daughter. A few weeks later, a letter from Lafayette arrived at the Hôtel de Neuilly, allowing its inhabitants to breathe a sigh of relief. Quote, "I must begin by telling you that I am perfectly well, because I must end by telling you that we fought a difficult battle last night, and that we were not the strongest. Our Americans, after having stood their ground for some time, ended at length by being routed. While I was trying to rally the troops, the gentlemen of England did me the honor of shooting me, which hurt my leg a little, but it is nothing, my sweetheart, for the ball touched neither bone nor nerve, and I will only have to stay in bed for a little while, which has left me in a bad mood. I hope, sweetheart, that you won't be anxious. You should not be. I shall be out of combat for some time, and you can be sure that I will take good care of myself. This defeat, however, I fear, will have harsh consequences for America." End quote. Indeed, the defeat at Brandywine was a catastrophe. The Americans lost 1,000 men, nearly an entire tenth of their army. Worse still, they were forced to abandon Philadelphia. Congress evacuated the city and re-established themselves in the town of York, Pennsylvania, far to the west. In the midst of the retreat, South Carolina Congressman Henry Laurens took it upon himself to transport the wounded Lafayette to Bethlehem, a settlement founded by the Moravians, the German-speaking adherents of a pacifist sect of Protestant Christianity who, although exempt from military service, operated a number of hospitals in the area to care for wounded soldiers. While en route, Lafayette and Laurens struck up a friendship that had the potential to greatly benefit the former of the two, when the latter was elected president of the Continental Congress a short time later. On September 21st, Laurens deposited Lafayette at Bethlehem before making his way to York. A week later, the British captured Philadelphia. On October 4th, Washington tried to lead a counteroffensive, hoping to retake the capital after defeating the British at a Philadelphia suburb called Germantown. This ended in absolute failure, with the Americans losing nearly 700 men and being forced to retreat once more. Lafayette, still languishing in his bed at Bethlehem, some 35 miles or so to the northwest, suffered more acutely from boredom than the physical pain in his leg. Left with little else but his overactive imagination, Lafayette's mind raced to think of new and audacious schemes that might turn the tide of the war. One such idea that he proposed to Prime Minister Maurepas involved recruiting French privateers from Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique to carry out raids against British colonial holdings in the Caribbean. After this had been accomplished, the fleet would then sail east to disrupt British supply lines in India. Maurepas scoffed at Lafayette's suggestion, saying, quote, "Someday he will end up auctioning off all the furniture in Versailles to support the American cause, because once he gets something in his head, it's impossible to resist him." End quote. While Maurepas and other ministers of the king in France did not take Lafayette's more audacious schemes seriously, Lafayette had, by this point, largely succeeded in establishing himself as the main liaison between the American civil and military leadership on the one hand and the French court on the other. In his letters back home, he made it a point to extol the virtues of the Americans and their cause, describing Washington and the other leaders with whom he'd been acquainted in very glowing terms. He urged his wife and others to do the same. Quote, "The enemies of America may tell you that they are beaten. Leave politely and say, 'You are imbeciles.'" End quote. At the same time, Lafayette did his best to continue vouching for the character of the French officers who were still arriving in America on a regular basis seeking to be granted commissions. As he explained in a letter to Henry Laurens, quote, "Being honored with the name of French, I consider it my duty to recommend to you every honest countryman of mine." End quote. Lafayette's emerging role as an interlocutor between France and the United States came about at a critical juncture in the course of the war. In two separate engagements fought on September 19th and October 7th, the Continental Army encircled and defeated a 7,000-man-strong British force under General Burgoyne in upstate New York. He surrendered to the Americans unconditionally, and his entire army was taken prisoner. These victories, known collectively as the Battle of Saratoga, had an immediate and electrifying effect. It marked a major reversal in the fortunes of the American war effort and emboldened Congress to approve the Articles of Confederation, a significant precursor to the American Constitution a month later. The effects were even more significant at an international level, as it served to convince many foreign observers that an American victory was not only possible, but perhaps even close at hand. Lafayette greatly exaggerated the scale of the British defeat in his correspondence back home, which the European press reported as fact. Many of these claims bordered on the ridiculous. A French newspaper in Amsterdam reported that at Brandywine, Lafayette had defeated a British regiment of 2,000 men single-handedly. Lafayette's praises were sung across France, and his legend had already begun to take on a life of its own. Even the Duc d'Ayen finally managed to set his anger aside and expressed pride in his son-in-law. Lafayette's friend Ségur observed, quote, "The very people who had blamed him for his bold enterprise now applauded him," end quote. And as Lafayette's reputation in France grew by the day, so too did pro-American sentiment. After news of the Battle of Saratoga reached France, the foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, began to push more strongly for open French intervention in the conflict, emphasizing that there may be significant material rewards for backing the right side. Quote, "The power that will first recognize the independence of the Americans will be the first to reap the fruits of this war," end quote. Lafayette was every bit as optimistic as everyone else after Saratoga. He personally believed this was a prelude to the ultimate victory over the British. He was anxious as ever to throw himself into the fray, and from his convalescent bed in Bethlehem, he wrote to Washington asking once more to be given command over a regiment. Quote, "Consider, if you please, that Europe, and particularly France, is looking at me, that I want to do something by myself, and justify that love of glory which I let be known to the world in making those sacrifices, which have appeared so surprising, some may say even foolish. Do you not believe that this desire is right?" End quote. After having spent 2 months confined to a bed, Lafayette had recovered sufficiently from his wound by mid-October. He went to rejoin Washington at his camp outside Philadelphia, where he found the commander-in-chief embroiled in a heated debate about whether or not to besiege the former capital and to retake it from the British. Congress wanted the city back in American hands as quickly as possible, but Washington maintained that trying to retake it now was ill-advised. Lafayette sided with Washington. Winter would begin in a matter of weeks, and it would be difficult to maintain a siege under such conditions. Washington instead opted to set up a winter encampment in the strategic heights of Valley Forge, about 18 miles northwest of the city. In late November, as Washington was making preparations to march off to Valley Forge, he ordered General Nathaniel Greene to disrupt British forces in New Jersey. Eager as ever to get back into the action, Lafayette volunteered to join him on this mission, even though he still walked with a pronounced limp. Greene was a 35-year-old farmer from Rhode Island who had abandoned his pacifist Quaker faith to join the Continental Army. Everything he knew about military tactics and strategy he had taught himself, but this was sufficient enough to earn him a place as one of Washington's most trusted and capable commanders. Greene and Lafayette immediately took a liking to one another, with Greene writing to his wife of the Marquis, quote, "He is one of the sweetest-tempered young gentlemen. He has left behind a young wife and a fine fortune to come and engage in the cause of liberty. This is a very noble enthusiasm," end quote. On December 25th, Greene, Lafayette, and their men crossed the Delaware River and reached the town of Gloucester in New Jersey. Lafayette was sent ahead with a detachment of 400 troops to reconnoiter the area. To the distress of his men, Lafayette personally approached dangerously close to enemy lines in order to get a better sense of their positions. Returning to his detachment, he ordered an attack on an outpost where 400 Hessian mercenaries were stationed. The assault caught the Hessians by surprise, and they fled in disarray. Lafayette and his men chased after them for about a mile, inflicting on them more casualties before British reinforcements arrived and forced the Americans to withdraw. Lafayette and company returned to camp, having suffered only 6 casualties, 1 dead and 5 wounded. Greatly impressed by Lafayette's zeal, Greene dashed off an enthusiastic report to Washington, quote, "The Marquis, with about 400 militia, attacked the enemy's picket last evening, killed about 20 and wounded as many more, and took 20 prisoners. The Marquis is charmed with the spirited behavior of the men, although he seems determined to place himself in the way of danger," end quote. In light of his conduct at the Battle of Gloucester, Washington finally decided to grant Lafayette's request to be given command of a regiment. He wrote to Congress asking for this permission to be granted, and on November 30th, he told Lafayette that he could lead any division of his choosing. He eventually decided on a regiment of Virginia riflemen. Lafayette was positively elated. He had become a major general in more than name only. He took the occasion to write to his father-in-law, quote, "It is impossible to be more agreeably situated than I. The members of Congress, I know, overwhelm me with kindness and attention. The new president, Mr. Lawrence, is one of the most respected men in America and my particular friend. As for the army, I have made friends with everyone, with proof of such friendships forthcoming every day. The task I am performing here will improve my knowledge exceedingly. In the American Army, the rank of Major General is equivalent to that of the Lieutenant General and the Field Marshal in the most important functions, and as such I can apply both my talents and expertise. I read, study, examine, I listen and reflect, and I try to develop a reasonable common sense opinion. I do not talk too much to avoid saying foolish things, nor do I risk acting in a foolhardy manner. I do nothing to abuse the confidence with which the Americans have entrusted me." End quote. Lafayette went on in this letter to sing the praises of General Washington, lauding him for his, quote, "warm friendship and complete confidence in me regarding all matters, great and small." End quote. Whether this was an intentional slight towards his father-in-law or not is unclear. Lafayette also urged the Duke to petition the king and his ministers for more aid. Quote, "America is most impatiently expecting us to declare for her, and France will one day, I hope, decide to humble the pride of England. This hope, and the measures which America appears determined to pursue, give me greatest hopes for the glorious establishment of her independence. We are not, I must confess, as strong as I had expected, but we are strong enough to fight, and we shall do so, I believe, with considerable success. And, with the help of France, we shall win the cause I so cherish, because it is just, because it honors humanity, because it is in the interest of my nation, and because my American friends and I are deeply committed to it." End quote. Just before departing for Valley Forge, Lafayette also dashed off a letter to Adrienne, quote, "Do not worry about me. All the hard blows are over. All we face are some skirmishes at most. I am as safe in this camp as I would be in the center of Paris. If I could measure happiness by joy of serving here, by friendship of the army and its men, by the loving friendship and mutual confidence of the most respected and admirable men, by the affection of the Americans, all of these could sustain my happiness, and I would need nothing else. But my heart is still far from easy. How you would pity me if you knew how much my heart suffers without you and loves you. Have I 2 children now? Have I another infant to share my tender love with my dearest Henriette? Kiss my dear little girl 1,000 times for me, and embrace them both most tenderly. I trust they will know one day how deeply I love them. Will you too, sweetheart, always love me? I dare to hope so. Goodbye. How sweet it would be to kiss you now, to tell you myself that I love you more than I have ever loved, and as long as I will live." End quote. Adrienne had indeed given birth to the couple's second child, a girl named Anastasie, on July 1st of that year. What Lafayette did not know was that 4 months later, Henriette, their first child, suddenly fell ill and died. She was not even 2 years old. Because of the delays inherent to transatlantic communication, Lafayette would not learn for another 7 months that when he first departed France in April of 1777, he had kissed his poor daughter goodbye for the last time. And it's on that rather somber note that I will end the narrative for today. After a less than ideal beginning to his time in America, by the end of 1777, Lafayette's fortunes were on the rise. He'd gotten his first taste of battle at Brandywine, had the opportunity to command troops at Gloucester, and news of his exploits had already begun turning him into a celebrity, both in America and in France. Unfortunately, he and his American comrades were in for a difficult winter ahead, but you'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks to hear the next part of that story. If, in the meantime, you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else that you'd like for me to address, you can send these things my way via email at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter and Facebook, links to both of which will be in this episode's description. Additionally, if you like the show and want to help support it, consider purchasing some used books from me on eBay. A link will also be in the episode's description. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
Citoyen pour le bien soutiendra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au délirira, sans avoir à le troubler. Toujours le plus fort sera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Le peuple armé se gardera. Ah, ça ira,